Welcome, everyone. Let me begin by thanking the Cogut Institute for Humanities and Amanda Anderson, Cogut's director. Firstly, for bringing Tapati Guha-Thakurta here from the Center for the Studies in Social Sciences in Calcutta as a visiting scholar to Brown this fall. It's given me this fantastic opportunity to co-teach with her, and then for Amanda asking us to organize this symposium, not just on a small, humble scale as we had originally thought of, but on a grand scale. And so really have to thank her for bringing us all together here today. In the course of just the last 2 months, I have already incurred a great many debts to Tapati and having to teach with her. And organizing something like this would have been impossible without the wonderful staff of Cogut. We would like to particularly thank Kit for tremendous organizational and moral support, Damien for keeping us on track, as well as Trod, yes, as well as Trod and Melissa for being here and supporting us through this. In addition to the Cogut Institute, Leela Gandhi, who is directing the Center for Contemporary South Asia this year, has lent us her support through supporting the project Art History from the South and more directly this symposium itself. To all our guests, speakers, chairs, and discussants, some of whom have traveled from quite far, thank you so much for having accepted our invitation in the middle of what is possibly the busiest time of the semester. Thank you so much for being here for these 2 days in what we hope will be a timely and pressing conversation. I'm going to say a few words about this image I chose for the posters for our conference and for Art History from the South. And then I'll pass on the floor to Tapati to make a fuller introduction. They say Sarmad was an Armenian Jew who traveled to India in the 17th century and became a mystic. That he came as an ordinary trader, and by the banks of the Indus, he fell in love with Abhay Chand. That he abandoned himself to nature and roamed the streets naked. That the great prince and philosopher Dara Shikoh invited him to the Mughal court in Delhi, and that Aurangzeb, in rivalry with his brother or in abhorrence of the abandonment, had him beheaded for heresy. Recite the Kalma, he was ordered. There is no God but one God. And yet the only words, there is no God, came forth. Yet such was his mystical powers that when he was beheaded, he seized his own decapitated head and ascended the steps of the Jama Masjid, the great mosque of Delhi, his head in his hands, and behind him the river Jamna rose in wrath. For the ecstatic and prolific painter, calligrapher, poet Sadiq Khan, displaced from a small town in North India to Pakistan in 1947, an intense identification with Sarmad in this image of the beheaded artist painting himself before a canvas, an image that appears in various guises over and over again in his work over 30 years. This image raises some of the aporias of modernity in writing about art from the South. Has he been beheaded or has he beheaded himself? Do we grieve the violence of the beheading, or is this violence the very condition of possibility, the very condition of possibility of his very playfulness? Are these real passions and not just inventions of inheritance by which a transgressive mystic now becomes a modern artist? How does secular How does secular function as God and guardian of a domain called art, and as such, organize the very terms we think belief, legend, and the sacred, the terrain surrendered to the religious? If I were to tell you by way of footnote, in 1976, Sadeghian's exhibition was bombed on charges of obscenity, can we think with his image without further specificity? Can we still have Sarmat stand before us with his head in his hands, with his head in his hands? Tapati.
Okay. Thank you, Vazira. I'm immensely honored to be able to co-convene this symposium, and I'd like to profusely thank the Cogut Institute for inviting me to be here over this term to teach the course, from which I must say we're all learning a lot. It's becoming a faculty-level conversations as much as it's teaching students. So I must say that's been quite a learning experience. And of course, doing the symposium, it's the first time ever that I'm organizing a symposium here. So again, thank you for enabling this. To briefly then introduce the symposium, and I won't take very long at all. Vazira spoke about the image around which she conceived for the symposium. At the heart of the concerns running through the symposium is the embattled category of the secular and the specific crisis that it confronts all over the world, but perhaps particularly in contemporary South Asia. One of the main intentions of bringing all of you together in this symposium is to bring into conversation the large body of critical reflections on the ideology and politics of secularism in the subcontinent, with the debates and dilemmas that have riddled the institutions of art, the discipline of art history, and contemporary art practices in that geopolitical space that we today call South Asia. If you were to look upon the notion of secularism, and here, Akeel, I'm drawing on your new book. If you were to look upon the notion of secularism as primarily a political doctrine and distinguish it from the broader cultural and intellectual scope of the denomination of the secular and the process of secularization, and I think you importantly bring up that distinction, how do we bring these latter terms then, secular and secularization, to bear on the field of art history and think of the ways it has positioned the past and present of South Asian art? If secularism consists first and foremost, again drawing on your work, Akeel, as a stance to be taken about religion, it is important to ask how has the secularized discipline of art history strategically produced, classified, and managed the many claims of the religious that reside within it. Through the evolving discipline of art history and its institutional apparatus in South Asia, there was an elaborate distilling of a secular field in which both the art of the ancient and medieval past as well as of the modern nation came to be positioned. The modern epistemology of art could accommodate as effectively the religious productions and iconographies of the nation's past, as well as the repertoire of divine and mythological imagery in the modern art of the nation. So in some sense, both can be framed within the new secular epistemic category, which we call art. Yet, over the past decade, the once taken for granted secular habitus of art in contemporary South Asia appears more threatened than ever before. Amid surging clamor of the religious and its politics of offense-making and offense-taking, in this context, how should we comprehend the shifting field of art objects and their histories? Do we look upon these shifts as the inadequate formations of the secular or the restoration of the fundamentally religious content of art? This symposium positions itself at the cusp of two dominant discourses in the field of South Asian art history. One, a lingering trend of Orientalist and nationalist projections that emphasize the quintessentially religious nature of South Asian artistic traditions as against the secularization of art in the West. The other, a counter assertion of the powerful place of art within the modern secular life of nations that takes for granted the transition of objects from earlier religious to new artistic denominations within the disciplinary folds of museums and art histories. One of the concerns of the symposium will be to question these temporal, spatial, and cultural binaries between the religious and the secular, and look at the current forms of interlocutions and interpolations of both these categories in contemporary scholarship as well as in art practice. As an invitation to interrogate the secular temporality of art, this symposium, we hope, will raise a number of questions. How do we complicate the religious designations of the field of pre-modern art and architecture and its relationship to the nation form? What are the residues, returns, and reinventions of the religious in the contemporary? How do we reconceptualize the public and the political as fiery contestations and new curatorial practices reconfigure the meaning of objects through the mediated spaces of museums, galleries, biennales, and the academy? How do we understand South Asian disciplines' deep entanglements with the politics of the present? Do we have to fundamentally rethink the art of art history itself in order to understand and intervene in our turbulent present? Drawing on a bit of my own work, I will end by briefly posing the problems of this conference by juxtaposing a set of images. Very well known to most of you. In the one case, I show you the paintings of the most iconic modern Indian artist, the most iconic Indian artist of independent India, Maqbool Fida Hussain, who came under a slew of violent attacks that forced him into a life of self-imposed exile. Here are some of his many depictions of Hindu goddesses that were forcibly stripped of the immunities and protections of the worlds of art and made to account for charges of religious offense in a public political domain to which they never belonged. And in the other case, I offer examples of experimental Durga imagery by modern artists in a religious festival that has now been converted into the city's biggest public art event. And I speak here of Kolkata's Durga Puja festival. But where the desire of the devotional icon to become a work of art hangs at the precarious edge of promise and deferral, with no institutional arrangements in place to secure their post-festival afterlives as preserved works of art. If both sets of works, Hussein's and these Durga images, willfully refuse the nomenclature of the religious, they equally resist the label of the secular. Together they speak to the contentions and paradoxes that have arisen from the repeated gerrymandering of boundaries between the artistic and religious object across different institutional and public sites in contemporary South Asia. Okay. Now, so we're really looking forward to a full day of intense conversation around these subjects. But we'll begin with our keynote today by Akeel Bilgrami, who'll speak on Is There an Indian Secularism? And Akeel's keynote session will be chaired by the director of the Cogut Institute, Amanda Anderson. So I'll very briefly introduce her. She wanted us to make it as brief as possible. So Amanda is the director of the Cogut Institute for Humanities and the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of English and Humanities, a distinguished scholar of 19th and 20th century literature and culture. Her work has addressed many pressing questions of intellectual history, disciplinary formations, and the relations between literature, moral life, and politics. Her most recent books are Bleak Liberalism, 2016, and Psyche and Ethos, Moral Life After Psychology, in 2018. So Amanda and Akeel, please. And I'll keep this on.
Thanks. It's an absolute honor to be hosting this symposium. I want to thank Tapati and Vazira for the wonderful work that they've done. And I just want to remind everyone here that we have a full day of talks and conversation tomorrow, beginning at 9 and going through till 7. There will be brochures available in the back at the end of tonight's lecture, so you can pick that up, or you can always look at the schedule on our website. We hope to see you tomorrow. Bring your umbrella. There'll be really good food. Kit is famous for her conference trail mix, so you really want to come. Okay. So I'm very pleased to be welcoming Akeel Bilgrami back to Brown this evening. He is one of my favorite academics. Akeel is the Sidney Morgenbesser Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University and directed the South Asian Institute there from 2013 to 2016. He also served as director of the Heyman Center for the Humanities from 2004 to 2011 and as chair of the philosophy department from 1995 to 1999. He has held visiting professorships at many universities here and abroad and has received numerous awards, fellowships, and grants. Akeel works across two broad and typically rather separate scholarly areas: philosophy of language and mind, and philosophy, politics, and culture. His books include Belief and Meaning, Blackwell, 1992, Self-Knowledge and Resentment, Harvard, 2012, and Secularism, Identity, and Enchantment, Harvard, 2014. He's also edited several important collections, including Beyond the Secular West, 2016, and Gandhi, Marx, and Modernity, 2014. Beyond this, Akeel has written over 100 articles and essays, which have appeared across a range of journals. I refer you especially to his many publications in critical inquiry over the years, to his postings on the influential website The Imminent Frame, and his essays in wider circulation periodicals, such as the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, The Nation, and the New Republic. Given the vast extent of his scholarly contribution, I will restrict myself to isolating what I take to be the central contributions of his writings over the past decade or so. First, Akeel's writings have worked to complicate and illuminate our understanding of identity and belief, two key terms in contemporary political and cultural theory. Akeel helpfully situates his discussion of identity by taking the distinction between first-person and third-person perspectives as a starting point, which is to say, he insists from the start that it makes a world of difference whether one takes oneself to hold an identity, and further, whether that identity is intensely held and connected to political aims, or by contrast, whether an identity is imposed upon one or considered as a primary, salient fact about one, regardless of one's own views about its relevance or importance. Throughout his work, Akeel privileges the agency-suffused, self-authorizing, first-person perspective over the third-person or external perspective, though without denying practical, analytical, and historical relevance to the latter. This privileging will be important to his attempts to move beyond disabling analyses of various forms of political or social psychology, including especially accounts of whole swaths of the public as acting against their own interests, as in popular accounts of non-wealthy conservative Republicans, for example, or in theories of false consciousness, which have had many afterlives since Marx. In place of such approaches, Akeel brings a nuanced account of moral psychology to bear on some of the more tense and volatile political issues surrounding identity in our time. While identities can be and are used for political purposes to mobilize around a given goal, such as national independence or gender justice, they also register complex political histories and serve important psychological roles as a source of dignity and self-respect, solidarity and belonging, etc. The second major avenue pursued by Akeel's work surrounds secularism and Enlightenment, and is, of course, the occasion for his presence here tonight. In this arena, Akeel is doing something very important and also distinctive. He's making an argument for secularism as a political doctrine, while also arguing for a conception of radical enlightenment that acknowledges enchantment, or a values-suffused world. In his argument for secularism, Akeel extends his emphasis on internal reasons for commitment and belief to the political project of building a secular polity. Central to his vision here is the importance of engagement and dialogue with an aim to uncover compatible internal reasons across differences, as well as an insistence that history is open-ended and that beliefs and commitments can and do change over time. Akeel's work on radical enlightenment, which interestingly deepens or reinflects the work on secularism, uncovers radical enlightenment as a persistent strand in cultural and political history stemming from the early modern period through Romanticism and beyond, one which envisions an entirely transformed relation both to nature and to political life, which seeks to promote a being at home in the world, or alternately put, a secular enchantment of the world, and which includes figures as disparate as Spinoza, the English Protestant reformer Gerard Winstanley, William Blake, and Gandhi. Radical enlightenment counters or dissents from the disenchantment of the world associated with the Enlightenment proper, which is associated with a predatory commercial attitude toward nature, modern scientific rationality in the service of capitalism and colonialism, the world impoverishing effects of disenchantment and alienation, and a limited model of democratic politics. I've focused here on Akeel's writing. It is now time for you to have the enchanting experience of hearing him lecture. Please join me in welcoming Akeel Bilgrami to Brown and to the Cogut Institute for the Humanities.
Thank you, Amanda. It's nice to be back at your center in such excellent company. Thank you for asking me, Tapati. We cannot just stipulate that the term secularism means this or that thing. We must expend a lot of intellectual effort to show that any such stipulation is not arbitrary. And to do that, we have to follow the demands both of theoretical analysis as well as history and conceptual history, which may pull in different directions. It would be to make oneself arcane to produce a philosophical analysis that departed radically from the conceptual history of the term. Thus, philosophy must keep faith with history and philology if its deliverances are to be non-arbitrary. And this is not just an academic exercise, but a way of understanding our past as well as our political future. It is incessantly said of the Indian modern that Jawaharlal Nehru was its chief architect, if not also its builder and mason. To underline this commonplace, Nehru is often contrasted by many of his admirers as well as his detractors, to stand in contrast with Gandhi, who is said to have aspired to hold Indian modernity in abeyance. But I want to assemble some points to try and show to show not only that when it comes to secularism in particular, there's far greater affinity in their thought and the ideals that motivated their actions than these stark contrasts propose, but moreover, that secularism as a doctrine, if it is properly understood in its non-arbitrary and historically situated terms, was not a very central ideal for either of them in the period in which they lived and worked together, not even for Nehru. So this might seem like a perverse thing to say, but I'm going to try and establish that. And as a result, I'll focus a bit on Nehru because that's the surprising conclusion of the argument I want to give, that secularism was not central for Nehru through the period that he and Gandhi worked together. And once this argument is in place, it may become easier to understand the significance of their appeal to secularism on the occasions on which it did sometimes surface in their thought and writing from the 1940s onwards, and how that relates to the fierce focus on secularism in our own more recent times. It is an utterly familiar point that secularism had its roots in European history of the modern period. The idea that one sometimes hears that secularism may be found in various parts of the world in much earlier times, such as during Ashoka's reign, or in medieval Andalusia, or Mughal India, conflates various distinct ideals under the term secularism for reasons that are theoretically very badly motivated. Not all good things are the same good thing. And though there may be rhetorical and strategic reasons to make these unconvincing equations, they bring no conceptual illumination. Much of the debate in our own time in India has been over three positions regarding this originary source of the concept in the modern West, with some saying that India must, in order to emerge as a modern nation, follow the West in its secularism, and others rejecting this response as slavish mimicry, while yet others taking the view that secularism is certainly highly relevant for India, but it means something entirely different in the Indian context. In particular, secularism in the Indian context is the idea of a state's neutrality between religions. This disputation is confusing and could do with some sorting out, and I have some hope that such analysis as I shall try to provide by the end of this paper will cause some, at least, of this tide of confusing controversy to subside. To get some clarity on the issue, we must at the outset make an elementary distinction between secularism and secularization. Tapati already did. Secularization, a topic first fully explored by Max Weber, unlike secularism, is not a doctrine so much as a name for a process of transformation in society. It has, in the sociological and historical literature, been described by two different rhetorics: the death of God and the quite different rhetoric of the decline of magic and ritual, thus addressing religion as both belief and as cultural practice. Loss of belief in God or in the myths of creation on the one hand, and decrease in church-going or habits of pious dress, dietary restrictions on the other, were two distinct symptoms of the process of secularization in the European modern, speaking respectively to secularization of religious doctrine and practice respectively. The concept of secularism, by contrast, is concerned less with general historical processes of social and cultural transformation, and more concerned instead to describe specific institutions and laws that form a polity, that is, a polity that seeks to shield the formulation and functioning of its laws and institutions from the control and direct influence of religious practices and belief. This distinctness of secularization from secularism has its proof, first of all, in the obvious fact that someone can be deeply religious in both belief and practice, thus not secularized, but be deeply committed to secularism, that is, to secular polity. And second, in the equally ubiquitous fact that the same place can be secularist in this sense and yet not much secularized, such as, for instance, the United States, especially in its heartland. Or it may be highly secularized and yet not secularist, as, for instance, in a city like Tel Aviv. Western Europe and Australia are perhaps the regions of the world where there is most coincidence of both secularism and secularization, while Saudi Arabia and the city of Jerusalem are examples of places where there's least presence of either. It is, of course, possible to try and undermine this distinction by dragging cultural matters, say, for instance, habits of dress, into the realm of policy and polity and law. Thus, France erected some of its cultural prejudices about the hijab into the political realm by actually passing policies and laws about dress in public places. But I will assume, for the sake of simplicity, that for the most part we can maintain a relatively lucid distinction in the study of religion between its significance on the one hand for cultural matters such as, say, those of dress or diet, and on the other for political matters such as, say, free speech or gender justice. Like with all distinctions, one can strain to dissolve this one too, but there's conceptual clarity and illumination to be gained in insisting on it, while noticing and allowing that in many specific contexts, such as Kemalist Turkey, or in the case of France just cited, it can get muddied. My focus will be entirely on secularism, though I'd be very curious to explore during the discussion the quite possibly different things we would say about the conference's focus on art, if we keep firmly in mind this at least prima facie and preliminary distinction between secularism and secularization. I actually think a great deal of the contrast that has been drawn between Gandhi and Nehru on this terrain has drawn together the more obvious contrast in their thinking about the issues of secularization with the much less obviously contestable attitudes they had on the concept of secularism. The emergence of secularism as an ideal and doctrine owes to the political fallout of a certain trajectory in the justification of state power in Europe, from within which the ideal of secularism emerged. The 17th century in Europe brought remarkable changes in outlook, owing, among other things, to the links that grew between new ideas and emerging worldly forces. With the rise of the new sciences, and then via their institutionalization, their increasing elevation to centrality in European culture, starting with the Royal Society in England, then via Netherlands, moving all across Europe, older forms of justification of state power that focused on the divine right of the state as it was personified in its monarch came to be seen as unsustainable. At the very same time, a new form of entity was emerging after the Westphalian peace. Both these developments converged to produce a radically new political outlook. State power now came to seek its legitimacy in a quite different and far more mundane source, no longer in theology, divine rights, but for want of a better word, in political psychology. It must be made to rest on a feeling present in the people over whom it exercised power. The feeling that they were to cultivate was not to be directly a feeling for the state itself. Rather, it was to be towards this new form of entity that was spawned by the Westphalian peace, the nation. This entity was, of course, partly defined in terms of territorial boundaries, but that did not by any means suffice to characterize it. The characterization was not complete until it was fused with a new form of increasingly centralized state, which integrated the more scattered locations of power of a previous time. Thus it was that the nation and the state were existentially fused in their status, undecouplable from each other, and inseparability identified by a hyphen. And so a feeling among the populace for the first half of the hyphenated conjunction, nation, bestowed upon its second half, the state, a new form of legitimacy for the exercise of its power. Later, this kind of feeling came to be called nationalism, and the justification it provided for state power was both fundamental and peculiar to the European modern until it began to spread via colonial conquest to other lands. However, what is more immediately relevant to understanding Nehru and Gandhi and the national movement is to look closer at the strategy by which this political psychology, this feeling for the nation and thereby legitimacy for the state, was generated all over Europe. it was done by a method which had its apotheosis in Germany in the 1930s and 40s of the last century, though its work was done well before that. It was the method of generating a feeling for the nation as ours by finding an external enemy within the territory and describing it as them, the outsider within, to be despised and suppressed as the other. Of course, by the time it came to that hideous culmination in Germany, religion played little, if any, role in the ideology by which the strategy was wielded. Race loomed far larger in the rhetoric. But in earlier exercises of such nation-building and state-legitimating exercises in Europe, religion was often a central factor. When numerical and statistical forms of discourse came to be applied to the study of society and governance, notions of majority and minority were constructed, and this method would come to be described as majoritarianism. Often religious majoritarianism would generate a religious minoritarian backlash. And the violence of civil strife that this in turn generated made it seem as if religious majoritarian nationalism was not the fundamental source of the problem anymore, even if it was where the fault line started, but it was religion itself that contaminated the polity, and until it was steered to sites distant from the orbit of the state in places of personal life and what came to be called civil society, the strife would not be quelled. So it was that the doctrine of secularism emerged as a large and corrective measure, essentially, as this narrative shows, to be a counter to a process that starts with nationalism founded on religious majoritarianism. So that's Europe for you. So, I mean, if you think this is happening in India today, it happened first in Europe. If we now turn our gaze to India in the long period of historical developments by which Nehru came to a position of leadership in Indian politics during the freedom struggle, we find that this concept of secularism, constructed and intended to counter the effects of such a form of damage, was never really a concept that Nehru made central. In this, he was quite at one with Gandhi. The reason for this is perfectly obvious, and it partly explains why there's no serious, extensive and detailed talk of secularism till after independence, just a little bit before independence for obvious reasons. To put it explicitly, since India never did go through that form of nation-building strategy, there was nothing in India's traditions that created the kind of political and social damage that fell out of the European forms of nationalism that I've just expounded. In short, what secularism is there to correct did not have for either Nehru or Gandhi any very audible echo in the socio-political life of India in the first place. There was nothing to be corrected. As Nehru frequently says in The Discovery of India, Indian society for centuries was characterized by a completely, and I'm going to use a term that I'll return to, was characterized by a completely unself-conscious pluralism. Okay, so I'm stressing unself-conscious here. And so my elementary argument is that it is not surprising that it never seemed imperative to him that India needed a self-conscious adoption of secularism, a doctrine very deliberately constructed to address the loss of pluralism through forms of majoritarian religious domination and defensive minoritarian reactiveness to it. That work of Nehru's, just like a range of writings by Gandhi from Hind Swaraj onwards, for all their many differences of attitude towards religion and science and superstition and so on, all matters that I've said are relevant to secularization, but not to secularism, constantly applauded India's lived pluralist traditions, their common cultures, developed out of a diverse people's mutual influence upon each other, the shared sites of worship, and all the other familiar elements of a civilization that came later to be captured in such tired phrases and cliches as composite culture, unity and diversity, and so on. Now, of course, it's very widely recorded that Nehru expressed grief and dismay at the political conflicts between Muslims and Hindus as they developed from the mid-1920s, and I will say more about this at the end, and no doubt from even earlier due to the communal divisions that the colonial masters are often said to have manipulatively constructed to pursue their own interests of rule. But it is also very clear from Nehru's writing that he did not wish to think of these as so entrenched that they were defining of Indian society. In fact, he repeatedly denied that they were and described them as anomalous recent developments which would be undermined by a loftier politics that draws on the more long-standing pluralism. To sum up then, Indian society for him, and even more explicitly for Gandhi, was not defined by the sort of problem that secularism was designed to repair, nor by the specifically European nationalism that created that problem. And so secularism did not have a centrality in his thinking, despite all the rhetoric against superstition and in favor of the scientific method and rational temper, all cliches of their own, even for those who subscribe to them, but irrelevant, as I insist, to the question of secularism, even if relevant to secularization. What this then allows one to propose is Nehru, in the first 3 or 4 decades of his political thought and activism, was constructing a political philosophy which had no centrally articulate place for the ideal of secularism, for the reasons I've just given, but which, tapping what he took to be the unself-consciously pluralist traditions of India's social past and present, was reconstructing and representing that pluralism in the political arena as a form of nationalism, and above all, a nationalism that was not only intended to be unlike the European nationalism, strategies I expounded earlier, but intended to prevent the emergence of that form of nationalism in India. If you wanted a slogan to summarize this interpretative proposal about Nehru and Gandhi's thinking, it is this: Indian nationalism would make unnecessary a secularism that was made necessary by the damaging effects of European nationalism, and it would do this by replaying the genuine and lived pluralism of ordinary Indian social life by mobilizing the minorities as well as Hindus in the political arena of anti-imperialism. Now, if this is to be plausible as a bit of analysis and argument about Nehru's and Gandhi's thinking on secularism, it will only be so because it has some empirical grounding in his political activism. Without that, the slogan would be empty. And so the crucial additional point is that both Nehru and Gandhi, at some peaks of their mobilizational efforts in the freedom struggle, tried to do their bit as leaders to ensure that that slogan was not empty. In a sense, the fact of the partition of the Indian subcontinent is a reflection of the ultimate failure of those efforts. But that in itself can't be a sign that the efforts weren't genuine, though Perry Anderson has produced a sloppy invective to say that it was. The fact of the partition of Indian subcontinent is a reflection of the ultimate failure of those efforts, but that in itself can't be a sign that the efforts were not genuine, only that in the end they were not efficacious. The reasons for that failure were many, including, no doubt, that the fact that those efforts were not strenuous enough at crucial moments. But this lecture can't really, doesn't have the scope to explore that. The argument of the lecture, therefore, is modest. It's restricted entirely to the point that secularism should be understood as a notion that has its conceptual genealogy in a historical context of a specific form of nation building in Europe. And since for Nehru and Gandhi that context didn't loom large or large enough in the period prior to independence, secularism played no serious role in their major political formulations. What they both assumed, an assumption I think that it would be cynical for us to dismiss with a misinterpreting hindsight, coming from the partition, was that a historically relatively entrenched pluralism in the subcontinent would be the basis for an alternative conception of nationalism. And it is to give that assumption some empirical support that I'm going to now turn. Since so much has been written on the freedom movement, let me just select very briefly and comment on two such efforts that illustrate the slogan's claim to inclusiveness of minorities, religious minorities, in the nationalist ideal, which would give evidence of the replaying of the pluralism in the freedom movement. The first of these is widely studied, though Nehru's feeling for it is less frequently recorded than Gandhi's, who was its originator. The second was conceived primarily by Nehru, though its leadership was for obvious reasons given to figures like K.M. Ashraf, and Nehru supported it to the last, even as some of his colleagues in the Congress High Command eventually pulled the plug on it. The Khilafat movement was a typical and early manifestation of Gandhi's political instincts, genius, and of his philosophical commitment to the form of inclusive pluralist nationalism that I'm claiming preempted the need for making secularism central. I choose it rather than the Congress League Pact, Muslim League Pact, of a few years earlier, which also marked such an inclusiveness via the compromise of the Congress, allowing separate electorates for Muslims, and the League reciprocating by embracing home rule. That choice is for two reasons. First, because I want to make things difficult for myself by choosing something that is contested by many as having the character of inclusiveness that I say it illustrates. So many people dismiss the Khilafat movement as a communal movement. A case, after all, is made stronger if one can work with examples that prima facie seem to suggest that one's case is wrong and show that what seems prima facie so is not so. And second, because the dynamic effects of the Khilafat agitation on the nationalist movement were far greater, far greater than the Lucknow Pact, the Muslim League Congress Pact, showing possibilities that went well beyond the electoral and constitutional effects of that earlier entente. But it would be quite wrong to think that Khilafat owed only to Gandhi. Nehru's excitement over what was opened up by the Khilafat movement is palpable, say in his autobiography. It's not as if Nehru had no qualms about the appeal to religion in the movement, but he saw that factor as in the end marginal. This is absolutely explicit in the autobiography. He says again and again that it's an eddy and backwater in the main direction of the flow of the struggle, which was anti-imperialist. A platform and a national strategy for much more than a Muslim cause, indeed far more than an anti-imperialist cause, because it brought to consciousness how the welfare of the peasantry was essential to any future ideal of the nation, and he devotes a chapter to wandering among the Kisans and their mobilization in the context of Khilafat. He writes about how surprised he was by the innocent and yet true instincts of a widespread confusion among the masses who confusedly thought that Khilafat came from the term khilaf and assumed that what it therefore expressed was opposition to the British government, taking that to be the main point of the agitation, just the form of subordination of the religious to the national that the movement aimed for, even as it included Muslims qua Muslims. Nehru describes in some detail the role of a subheading of a chapter, Maulvis and the Maulanas in Khilafat. This last point that I'm stressing, Muslims qua Muslims, is of central significance to this ideal of a different nationalism than Europe's, and I will return to it. The movement had a tremendously generative effect in many parts of the country. To take just one example, in the immediate aftermath of Khilafat, Bengali politics experienced one of its most dynamic periods, with C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru devising the Council Entry Plan to carry out sustained and obstructive interventions in the Legislative Council and As is well known, when this was thwarted by the Gaya session of the Congress in December of 1922, C.R. Das resigned and formed the Swarajya Party within the Congress, which gained immediate successes in the elections to the provincial legislature. He sought active participation by the Muslims, and soon thereafter, the Bengal Pact with them was formulated, a highlight of Hindu-Muslim amity that would not have happened were it not for the specific possibilities opened up by the Khilafat movement. The dividends for such a form of inclusive nationalism in progressive Muslim politics were measurable, even though they were local. Bengal is one locality, but very dynamic locality, and there's some very good literature on this by historians of the Khilafat's impact on Bengal. Consider the following very specific case that I want to focus on, bring out the progressive and dynamic effects of the Khilafat movement in Bengal. A close look at the details which surrounded the Women's Suffrage Bill, which was passed in 1925 in the Provincial Legislative Council, Bengal, after having been defeated 4 years earlier, suggests very strongly that it was the effects of the Khilafat agitation and the ensuing developments in Bengal, including the C.R. Das Pact, which was adopted in 1923, which was so central to this progressive legislative reversal. The suffrage bill was defeated earlier, Khilafat intervened, it was passed later. Muslim members of the Legislative Assembly had voted predominantly against the bill in 1921, but by 1925 it was the Muslim members, especially the Swarajist Muslims behind C.R. Das, who had been emboldened to vote for it in large enough numbers to make the difference and get the bill passed. And no whip was exercised for this. The entire catalyst provided by Khilafat gave them the confidence to allow arguments appealing to their own nationalist and pluralist values, which were pressed on them by their national colleagues, to internally trump their own other values by which they themselves had argued earlier for the opposite conclusion, that stricter observance of parda among their women would inhibit them from voting and put the community at a disadvantage. This is an absolutely standard Muslim anxiety about women's suffrage, and they overcame that anxiety to vote in favor of it. Even on economic issues, the effects of the Khilafat movement were progressive, as could be seen in the sizable support given by Muslims, jotedars, small peasants, as well as the radical element among the professional salaried classes, who supported the 1923 bill seeking reforms in land tenancy, though the bill went down due to the Hindu leaders of the Congress Swaraj Party backing the large Zamindars. I said these were provincial gains on radicalizing Muslims, but they reflected what a strategy of overtly including Muslims in a mass nationalist mobilization could produce by way of confidence in them to go well beyond their religious communal interests for progressive causes. And Bengal was by no means the only province to be affected. Uttar Pradesh, Assam was significantly transformed by the movement as well. The second effort at inclusive mobilization I've chosen is the Muslim Mass Contact Program, some 15 years after the Khilafat movement. Gyanendra Pandey, in an excellent work before he became a subaltern historian, this is his PhD thesis, has shown in his study of regional... Oh, sorry. So sorry. All right, I'll lean forward. Gyanendra Pandey has shown in his study of regional politics in Uttar Pradesh that for a variety of reasons which he carefully presents, the Muslims there had felt alienated from the anti-imperialist movement ever since the late 1920s, by which time the Khilafat movement's influence had ebbed. If the overall analysis I'm giving in this paper is right, an additional reason for this alienation is that by then, the momentum and the mobilizing effects of the Khilafat movement had completely subsided. And one may conjecture that this alienation that Gyan Pandey describes and analyzes is precisely why Nehru felt the urgent need in the first place to start something like the Muslim Mass Contact Program a decade later. This campaign, mass contact, was far less sustained than the earlier movement. It was aborted early, lasting about a year and a half in 37-38. But it is revealing, despite its brief and limited success, because of what motivated it, what exactly was intended by it, and the form it took. I'd said earlier that the Khilafat movement was a more effective form of inclusiveness in nationalist causes than the Congress-League Pact of 1916. But it's interesting to compare the pact with post-Khilafat Bengal Pact mentioned above, which was entirely different in its significance, because it emerged in the catalytic wake of a movement rather than via negotiations among leaders of communities. Nehru, in motivating and devising the Muslim mass contact program of the late 1930s, makes this point explicitly. In his words, "We have too long thought in terms of pacts and compromises with communal leaders and neglected the people behind them. That's a discredited policy. There must be direct contact with the Muslim masses." K.M. Ashraf was enlisted to organize such contacts all over the regions of the country to draw Muslims inclusively into the nationalist movement. This echoed the Khilafat goal, though because the precedent had already been set by that movement in the explicit terms of the Khilafat cause, it did not this time need any appeal to a symbolic Muslim cause in a foreign land. The short-term effects of the program were successful, very successful, ranging from the activism of the Guha-Thakurta in the Northwest to the academic community of Aligarh, lawyers and journalists and professional classes all over UP and Bihar. Even many sections of the ulama, most prominently those under Madani's leadership, and the Deoband Seminary and Jamiat al-Ulama, itself founded in the wake of the Khilafat movement, was staunchly supportive of the Muslim mass contact campaign and its non-sectarian nationalism, despite being Muslims, qua Muslims, who were being courted. The short-lived campaign's failure to sustain itself was partly due to the inability to gain full reach to the peasantry, and also due to the unstinting opposition both of Jinnah and the Muslim League, and of course the Mahasabite element in the Congress, especially at the regional and district levels. Gandhi was supportive throughout the campaign, but he did register disagreement with Nehru, saying that it would be better if Hindus and Muslims worked together with the Muslim masses, which would have been a slightly different conception of the campaign than one which left it to the leadership of K.M. Ashraf and a variety of local Muslim leaders in the regions to make the contact with the masses. Nehru was far less inhibited in allowing this autonomy so as to give the community a sense of confidence that they could, as Muslims, be fully participatory in causes that had no communal goals in particular. More than the other often remarkable moments in the long freedom struggle, the special relevance of the Khilafat and the Muslim mass contact campaign for this pluralist, inclusive nationalism that Nehru was striving for is that they gave justificatory substance to a well-known stance that Nehru took, the stance of often refusing to recognize Jinnah and the Muslim League as representative of a people that the Congress itself was proud to represent. This was a standard response that Nehru gave to Jinnah. "We stand for everyone," was Nehru's view, and we will speak with commitment on behalf of Muslims as well as Hindus. Now, the point is, this is really the point I'm stressing, that without efforts of this kind to mobilize under a banner that was unafraid to assert a Muslim cause, such as the Khilafat, or to assert the name Muslim in pursuing a program to contact the masses, there was no reason to believe the Congress did in fact represent the Muslims. Simply the presence of Muslim leaders in the Congress was not enough to make it a genuinely representative party of the Muslims, nor the more politically procedural ploys such as the granting of separate electorates. So the point really is that nationalism integrates and includes diverse communities only if it finds mobilizing causes in which those communities are given distinctive voice. That's That's what I mean by Muslims call Muslims. Even as the causes are in the end not sectarian. It is only movements of this kind that make for the inclusiveness of the nationalism, because it is now a nationalism negotiated by different participatory voices. I've used the word negotiated here with careful deliberateness, despite it seeming as if movements are the very opposite of negotiation. As is stated in Nehru's remarks that I quoted when he started the mass contact program. Let me explain. The term negotiation is ambiguous. Nehru, as I cited him, said, the Congress must get past negotiated outcomes such as leaders meeting and coming to a pact. That is one notion of negotiation. People sitting around round table conferences and so on. But the movements I've been commenting on that Nehru, like Gandhi, made central to nationalism provides sites of public education for large numbers of ordinary people, and in doing so provides a quite different negotiation into common causes. It is not hard to see what they had in mind by this. There is the sort of negotiation that occurs around tables with representatives, leaders. But one also uses the term in expressions such as, they negotiated the traffic. It is this latter use of the word that suits better what Gandhi and Nehru meant by the power of movements like Khilafat and the Muslim mass contact program to include minorities in a negotiating inclusiveness of a national cause. Movements carry a people in a cause through public education and debate into an understanding of the full rationale and purpose of the cause. Nehru is explicit on this, declaring that a particular community, through the various practices of mass participation of this kind, learned to navigate as a community a cause that is larger than its immediate communal interest. Thus, there are two notions of negotiation, and the refusal to formally negotiate with the leaders and representatives of sectarian parties like the Muslim League would have been a crippling defect in the matter of inclusiveness if these alternative, more substantially and dynamic negotiative popular mobilizations were not also commitments that Nehru and Gandhi made. These latter gave substance to the Congress' claim to be representing Muslims, and neither Jinnah nor his recent scholarly defenders really understood or acknowledged it. Or I think it's actually better to say that Jinnah himself understood it very well and was alarmed by it, and worked very hard to undermine its dynamically inclusive effects by his own politics of bargaining for the interests of educated, metropolitan Muslims, a strategy that goes back to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, with considerable provincial autonomy, that was his goal, for the Muslim majority regions. Jinnah basically represented the careerist Muslim in UP. That was his chief base, urban Muslim. I want to be careful not to give any impression here of a Congress nationalistic anti-Jinnah bias in what I'm saying. My point is merely to record that Jinnah's politics, representing a much narrower class of Muslims throughout this period between the 1920s and 30s, was deeply at odds with the mass politics of Muslim inclusion which these two movements that Gandhi and Nehru had respectively devised. I have no wish to tarnish Jinnah with a separatist brush, but only to say that even after we acknowledge that his rhetoric of separatism was a bargaining weapon for greater autonomy for Muslim majority regions in a united India, something his defenders have plausibly argued for, the inclusiveness of nationalism nevertheless meant something entirely different for Jinnah than it did for Gandhi and Nehru in these mass mobilizations that Gandhi and Nehru had worked very hard in these two periods that I'm talking about, and which filled Jinnah with alarm. In making the distinction between two notions of negotiation and drawing its implications, my argument, accounting for the peripheral place of secularism in India in the pre-independence period, succeeds only to the extent that one stresses, as I've been doing, these dynamic efforts of mobilization by Nehru and Gandhi with the substantial forms of negotiated exclusiveness that they carry with them. Once independence was close to being achieved in the way and form that it eventually was, with all the trauma around partition and the political and religious acrimonies that led to it, the assumption of an inclusive nationalism of the kind that would preempt secularism as a central notion began to falter, and the rhetoric of secularism, just for that reason, began to emerge more conspicuously in the public arena, even in the speeches of Nehru and Gandhi. I've been focusing so far on Nehru in that period before India gained independence, and I've been arguing that secularism was never a very important notion for him in this entire period, because secularism, properly understood in its non-arbitrary, historically accurate sense, is necessitated by the effects of a form of majoritarian nationalism that is intended to combat a form of nationalism owing initially to Europe and which Nehru wished to avoid in India. Now, it is almost tempting to say that the nationalism that Nehru and Gandhi were trying to construct was India's version of secularism. But that temptation is wrong. All such forms of redefinition of secularism to claim an indigenous form of something that was entirely different from what originated elsewhere, a sort of obsessive tick in Indian academics today, makes for no clarity and just introduces clutter, conceptual clutter, and ambiguity. So, to drive this home, I want to turn now to the period after independence and explore briefly what secularism, conceived in these historically motivated terms of a European pedigree, came to really mean in India. So I'm now turning from the historical and conceptual genealogy to the more theoretical task of how to define or analytically characterize secularism. As I said, two different things. You have to keep faith with the history, conceptual history, and to give a philosophical or theoretical analysis. So I'm turning to the latter now. In Europe, once religion in the realm of the polity became a target of secularist policy for the historically motivated reasons I've presented, the familiar and celebrated formulation of a range of rights and constitutional principles became the natural and obvious source from which that policy sought to target and constrain religious practices. These were precisely the sources which became relevant in the Indian context after independence, and talk of secularism was inevitable in the constitutional issues that came to be debated and resolved through the legal process. The British Crown had enacted codes of civil and criminal law as far back as 1858. But this left substantial matters having to do with religious law and practice still unattended by a code of this kind, matters such as temple entry, administration of religious establishments and endowments, but most particularly, as is well known, personal or family law remained uncodified due to the sensitivities in broaching matters where religion was most intensely felt and lived by religious people. Many of these matters were addressed with reformist purpose in the construction of the Constitution, but the matter of personal law was addressed later in the Hindu Code Bill of 1955, partly as a result of the force of Nehru's personal influence, as well as the sturdy determination of Ambedkar's efforts in overcoming opposition from conservative Hindu voices, often within the Congress Party. The subject of secularism is obviously now relevant to these developments of reform in India. So that's when secularism emerged as a concept. How could it fail to be relevant? But it seemed entirely unclear to many what secularism was said to mean, given how these reforms were enacted. A standard understanding of the meaning of secularism is found in long-standing slogans of Western polities, such as separation of church and state. But the manner in which these reforms were conducted in Hindu law found the state brazenly violating the wall of separation between church and state and intervening with religious interpretations of Hindu law to justify many of the reforms. There was no wall. It was constantly perforating the wall. Thus, if that slogan of separation defined secularism, then these developments violated secularism in the name of achieving reform that purported to be secularist. This paradox has led political commentators such as Amartya Sen, but Radhakrishnan before him, to simply draw back and claim that secularism in the Indian context must really mean something entirely distinct from what it is taken to mean in the West. Sen and Radhakrishnan have claimed that, and now there's an infantry of academics who follow them in this, have claimed that Indian secularism comes to religion not by way of any form of opposition to it, but rather as a form of neutrality between different religions in India. And indeed, though this idea of neutrality between religions was very much part of the rhetoric of many Indian leaders who spoke about secularism since independence, and though it even occurs in some of Nehru's writings and speeches, it does not do so as a definition of secularism, but rather as a general bit of wisdom. How exactly that wisdom relates to what Nehru did understand by secularism is an interesting question, and I'll try and give a more or less exact answer to it. In the Indian context, since independence, secularism was something entirely in keeping with Western ideas about it, shorn of the misleading sloganization about a wall of separation. The articulation of secularism for Nehru and in the Indian constitutions begins, so here's my analysis, begins with two background commitments. First commitment, a commitment to freedom of religion. It's just there in the Constitution. Okay? So I'm not characterizing what secularism was for Nehru. It has two background commitments. The definition has two background commitments. First, a commitment to freedom of religion. Two, second commitment, to certain fundamental constitutional rights that neither mention religion nor mention opposition to religion. They're neutrally formulated. Okay, so the two commitments, background. One is freedom of religion and practice of religion. Two, a commitment to certain fundamental constitutional rights that neither mention religion nor opposition to religion. These latter are the basic ideals that a society in its polity seeks to live up to, and it will bring the resources of the state, including its conceptual resources, to do so. In liberal polities, free speech and gender equality, conceived as rights, are familiar examples of such ideals. They do not make any explicit mention of religion or opposition to religion. The articulation then proceeds, crucially, to a third clause. So there are these two commitments, and then there's a third, if you like to call it a meta-commitment. And that I define as a lexicographical ordering. I'll explain that in a minute. A lexicographical ordering of these two commitments. The ordering is as follows. Were there to be a clash between the deliverances of the commitment to freedom of religion, the first commitment, and the basic ideals enshrined in rights in liberal societies that neither mention religion nor opposition to religion, if there was a clash between these two commitments, then the latter must be placed first. In other words, if there turned out to be religious practices, which given the first commitment were being freely exercised, that ran afoul of the rights that were mentioned in the second commitment, neutrally described rights, then the latter should be placed first, and those religious practices should accordingly be constrained or disallowed. That disallowance directly follows from the lexicographical priority of the second commitment over the first. The idea of a lexicographical ordering, which originally comes from dictionaries as conceived alphabetically, is elaborately, by the way, if you want to know an example of a lexicographical ordering that reflects secularism, the first entry for Bethlehem in the Random House Dictionary is a steel town in Pennsylvania. The idea of a lexical ordering comes from mathematics and sometimes is deployed in economics. There it is conceived in terms of a comparative preferences where an economic agent prefers any amount of good A to any amount of another B. More generally, if he's offered several bundles of goods, the agent will choose the bundle that offers the most A, no matter how much there is of B. This approximates, to some extent, the familiar thing we want from secularism, without any obscure and implausible metaphors of separation of church and state, which are constantly violated in reform. That is, it captures the idea that unlike secularization, even perhaps defying secularization, we will allow great latitude in religious practice as a freedom that is articulated in the first commitment, so long as those practices don't clash with the basic ideals of society that are neutrally formulated in the second commitment. This was the underlying notion of secularism that Nehru appealed to in promoting the cause of the reform of Hindu law. And it is a notion of secularism that keeps total faith with the conceptual history of the term in its European genealogy. A history that's been very badly described through the wall of separation metaphor. Now, unlike the ideal of neutrality between religions, this version of secularism is resolutely prepared to be non-neutral. Should some religions have commitments, say, to blasphemy laws, and should a society in question have basic commitments to freedom of speech, there will be the lexicographical ordering against practices of censorship and so on. If this lexicographical priority ideal is what secularism should be understood to be, how does it relate to the rhetoric of even-handedness or neutrality between religions that was often deployed even by Nehru himself? I think the right way to think of that sort of even-handedness is to see it as a side constraint. That is to say, one could demand that the application of the lexicographical ordering must be done even-handedly between all religions and not favor some religions over others. So, for instance, when in Britain, the last temptation of Christ was banned because Mary Whitehouse said it was blasphemous, Christ having homosexual fantasies on the cross and so on. Unacceptable. It was banned. Salman Rushdie's book was, not banned. Rushdie was defended by that. That's a failure of neutrality in the application of the only definition of secularism there is, the lexicographical ordering of secularism. So my point is that the relationship between this neutrality idea and what secularism really is that the neutrality idea is a side constraint to have an even-handed application of the only definition of secularism there is, which is the lexicographical ordering one. It's not an alternative definition. And just a clear analytical understanding of what happened in the Constituent Assembly debates, what happened in the Hindu Code Bill and so on, makes this absolutely clear. Viewed as such, neutrality between religions should not be an alternative conception. It should be, as I said, something that nests within as a side constraint, this, the only ideal of secularism that there is. All right, so I've argued then that the constant effort to redefine secularism in the Indian context as a neutrality, etc., is just simply a confusion about how to analyze what went on in the legal processes after independence. And I've argued that the historical or genealogical side of the notion of secularism had no relevance until after independence, and after independence it had relevance partly because of these legal processes, but because ever since the 1980s it became extremely relevant, obviously, because India was much more explicitly mimicking European ideals of nationalism. Now, it would be foolish to deny that what gives the concept of secularism this charge in the last few decades, since the 1980s, did certainly have premonitional antecedents that go as far back as the 1920s. The Mahasabhite element in the Congress and the Savarkar ideology, which explicitly sought just the form of European majoritarian nationalism that Nehru and Gandhi opposed, certainly did surface, as we know, again and again in the long freedom struggle. But what they sought did not take serious root until the 1980s. That is why I've used the term antecedents here with deliberate intent. Political historians, perhaps historians generally, ought in their analyses to observe a distinction that I would describe as the distinction between antecedents and roots. Something can be an antecedent of something else without being the root from which the latter flowers by some organic causal stages or path. These earlier Hindu communal elements were not the roots, that they were, I think, antecedents of what we've come to see emerge in India since the late 1980s. And of course, people can invoke antecedents, but that doesn't mean that they were the roots, a sort of organic causal path to what followed in the 1980s. All right. What is interesting to note is that, okay, so I'm just adding a further topic here. What is interesting to note is that in the post-migratory political cultures of European nations since the Second World War, and Canada and Australia, a doctrine came to articulation of a self-conscious pluralism. And that term that was coined to describe this self-conscious pluralism, right? So the past I was describing as an unself-conscious. The term that was coined as a label for a self-conscious pluralism that was sought in post-Second World War Europe was multiculturalism. The motivations for this lie in a widespread perception that the secularism that was initially formulated to counter the ill effects of nation-building exercise in Europe were in fact quite insufficient in one crucial respect, that of speaking to recently migrated minorities in these nations, as well as to First Nation indigenous communities. And it is no small irony that multiculturalism, the self-conscious pluralism, as a special form of self-conscious attentiveness to the needs of and demands of minority cultures, came to be seen as a necessity because secularism was insensitive to those needs. Since it's an irony because it was secularism, as I said, that was initially intended to repair the damage of religious majoritarianism. So what explains this irony? As a repair for the ravages of majoritarian tendency, secularism has come to be seen as too blunt, since it was not merely taking a stand against religious majoritarian domination, it was a stand, but equally against religious minoritarian backlashes against that. It was a stand, therefore, against all religious practices, whether that of a minority or majority, placing those practices second whenever they clashed with the nation's neutrally formulated laws. In other words, because secularism addressed religious practice only as a generality, without differentiating between majority and minority religions, it did something to protect the minorities from previous forms of religious majoritarianism, but it did so at a level of abstraction from the detail of a minority's felt need to preserve its own religious sentiment, a particular problem in European nations as a result of their deliberate policy of admitting large immigrant populations, often with religious commitments from erstwhile colonies, to meet their labor shortages in countries reconstructing their economies after the loss of potential manpower in the Second World War. For these immigrant communities who found themselves in a new setting, frequently facing racial hostility, their religion often became a collective zone of comfort, and so the demand for preserving their religion as their only source for cultural dignity and solace began to be sharply articulated in what was perceived to be an alienating secularist polity, hostile to religion, so much so that it almost seemed to them that secularism had in fact exceeded its mission and virtually become a form of state-enforced secularization. And it would be apt for me to end a paper in a conference such as this by observing that what this last point allows us to say is that when artists and art historians, writing theoretically in India about modern Indian art, speak of a secularist critique of secularism, they misdescribe what they really have in mind. It is more accurately described, if I understand what they have in mind, in terms of this sort of articulation of a self-conscious, modern version of what Gandhi and Nehru characterized as an unself-conscious pluralist past. Necessarily self-conscious in order to overcome these alienating effects of the intervening period of secularism. So many of the things that Ghulam Sheikh and all have said are really, this is the right way to describe what they're after. Yet in these matters, artists have had to be constantly vigilant to changing political circumstances, as Karen Zitzowitz points out in a helpful survey of these artists. The genealogical account I've provided has it that the normative position is that when religious majoritarianism revives with any force, the more uncompromising stance becomes more relevant and secularism's point and rationale is fully in view again. But as a discussion, in particular, as Karen's discussion, in particular of the differences between K.G. Subramanian's early explorations of the Mahishasura story and those later after Ayodhya in 1990, possibly under the influence of Tayyab Mehta's own angles on the story, shows the alertness of artists to the shifting political context, as Karen points out, in the reading of Subramanian's early and later work, often adjusting away from self-conscious pluralism or multiculturalism to a more abstemious distance from the religious, exercising a secular distance in their work rather than relying on the free exercise of artistic expression that the political doctrine would allow. A case of self-imposed secularization, clearly reflecting that the political facts are working against the political norm. And as the case of M.F. Hussain, not to mention the open season of assassinations of journalists and public thinkers in contemporary India, makes clear, such self-imposed secularization, or in Hussain's case, self-exile, is only made necessary because of the state's refusal to implement its laws. In fact, when we keep talking about the lapse in secularism now, our rhetoric is they're not implementing the laws that are there of the liberal state. Here is a point of telling significance. I believe that way of describing it, that we have a liberal state which is not implementing its laws, is wrong. It is wrong, I think, to think of it merely as a secular liberal state's failure to implement its secular liberal laws. That separation of impeccable legislation and executive inefficacy is a fraudulent defense of liberalism for the following reason. When for over a century, the demands of labor for a range of economic rights had been bruited, liberalism had always maintained that there can be no economic rights of that sort, because liberalism only counts something as a right whose implementation the liberal state can guarantee. That's how liberalism defines rights. The capacity for the state to guarantee its implementation of the right is essential to calling it a right. That's why you can't have economic rights. So you can read Ronald Dworkin on this, for instance. So when for a century labor demanded economic rights, this was the answer. There can't be economic rights, the liberal state can't guarantee it. The liberal notion of right requires the implementability, the state's guarantee of implementability of the rights. It cannot guarantee economic rights, so rights must be restricted to such things as freedom of speech, freedom of worship, etc. A secular liberal state will spend millions of pounds to defend Rushdie against his censors and his would-be assassins, since free speech is a liberal right. But it cannot do anything to guarantee work, so the right to a job cannot be counted as a liberal right. In fact, given what everybody agrees, that capitalism requires a certain amount of unemployment for it to be capitalism, so just simply can't possibly accept the right to work as a right. You may try and produce policies for employment, but they can't be rights, given the notion of right in liberalism. Well, if this is so, if law and its executive implementation are conceptually inseparable in this way for liberalism, then a polity such as India's that refuses to guarantee to its artists, dissenting journalists, the implementation to the liberal right of free speech and artistic expression cannot consistently be counted as a liberal state. You can't have it both ways. Liberalism cannot consistently exclude something as a right, economic rights, on the ground that its implementation cannot be guaranteed, and then declare that a state is a liberal or secular state if such secular and liberal laws that it does allow to be included are not implemented. Contemporary India is not a failed liberal state. To call it that would be to miss the theoretical point I'm insisting on. By its own theoretical understanding of the nature of liberal rights, liberalism must declare India to be an illiberal state. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a few questions. I think we're going to move the mic right here. Anyone has a question? Flash me.
Thank you so much. My question is actually a few steps behind where you just ended, which was in your distinction of the genealogy of what constituted secularism and the way that nationalism played out in Nehru and Gandhi. I was wondering, I really appreciated the rigor with which you defined the lexicographical ordering that you say is underpinning secularism. But I was wondering then that what it seemed to be doing was pushing the task of pluralism if we can't have an Indian, so to speak, secularism, which is a pluralistic relationship to religion. You're pushing that ball down the road to nationalism,
Okay.
right? Because you're pushing it down to, or were you, is the open question, in the sense that narrated that history, you seem to suggest that at least Nehru and Gandhi believed that there was a pluralistic nationalism that would be revived. Is that the way that you're understanding nationalism?
Yeah, that's a very shrewd question, actually. It's very insightful of you because, you know, you're absolutely right that, well, let me speak to, in the West, this view has for long been articulated, Charles Taylor's view is that it's a neutrality between religions. I think roughly at the same time as Radhakrishnan first said it, and then Sen made a meal of it in that famous article of his. Now, what you're absolutely right to notice is that so I'm speaking to Taylor first, which is not the Indian context, and I'll come back to the Indian context. You see, as I tried to say at the end, secularism has now become a stick with which to beat multiculturalism, right? Because in the West, because it's not just right-wing nationalists who appeal to secularism, right? When right-wing nationalists appeal to secularism, just as when the Hindutva ideologues appeal to the Uniform Civil Code, liberalism or liberal ideas are not universal ideas. They are a tribal weapon against the Muslims on the one hand, or against immigrants and so on there. It's absurd to think that the idea of gender equality on the lips of a Hindutva ideologue or of free speech against Maghrebi immigrants in France, right? This is just a tribal weapon. It's free. All right, so secularism and its rights and so on have, in the last several years, not just by right-wing nationalists, but by secularists, right? I mean, by honorable people thought to be honorable, it's become a stick with which to beat multiculturalism. So what does Charles Taylor do? Charles Taylor is, at his core, a multiculturalist, honorable position. He decides he's going to take the stick away. So he's going to define secularism as multiculturalism. That's what he does. That's complete neutrality, let everything be equal and so on. What kind of a third-rate theoretic? I mean, politically it might be a fine motivation, but you don't do philosophy that way. Well, you don't say, I'm going to redefine the term because the politics is why aren't you? I mean, Ashish Nandi, after all, said, I'm against secularism. So if secularism is doing bad things, say it's doing bad things. I mean, you have to have the courage to say it's doing bad things. But intellectuals have these hurrah words and these boo words, right? So fascism is a boo word, but secularism is a hurrah. No matter what, everybody must come out as a secularist. Right? Democracy is like that too. So there's some words which are just hurrah words, and I think Charles Taylor's motivations here might be politically honorable, but you don't do theory that way. And I think exactly the same is going on in the Indian context.
I think everyone can hear me. The follow-up is just that, as you pointed out right at the end, if there are these sort of hurrah words, the way that you seem to be sort of taking the air out of secularism is by taking the pluralism out of secularism.
Well, I'm saying pluralism and secularism are different ideas. They really are different ideas. Right. Secularism emerged because of a destruction of unself-conscious pluralisms through nation-building exercises, right? And minoritarian backlashes against it. So it was felt, well, religion itself is what it's doing, because they're both majoritarian and minoritarian backlashes, both defined in terms of religion, and so religion itself must be kept out of the orbit. That's just really, I mean, just if you look at the intellectual history of the term, that's what it was in Europe. And Nehru and Gandhi said, well, it's not our problem. It's never been our problem.
And so is that also your stance on pluralism too? Is that you're just, the work that you're doing is to feel clearer, or is it a sort of reinstituting under nationalist projects? The way Nehru...
I'm saying that much later, I mean, if you look at the sorts of things which I only read because I read Karen's book, and Karen cites all these things. If you look at Ghulam Sheikh's interviews and writings on these subjects and so on, he's basically saying, let's revive a pluralism. I mean, let's look at these contexts in which, it seems to me it's not a secularist critique of secularism at all. It's rather the appeal to this kind of thing, just when the alienating effects of secularism that I described were happening. And, you know, Ghulam Sheikh wasn't doing what Charles Taylor does. Charles Taylor was saying, let's redefine the term. So he wasn't doing that. He was just responding completely sensibly to alienating effects. And I think, so my view is, just keep these two concepts separate. They are separate concepts. Why should all good things be the same good thing? Yeah.
Censored. It's a little strange. Thank you for reading my book. So, one clarification though. It's not a secularist critique of secularism. It's a secular critique of secularism, meaning it's one that explains, it's not meant to...
Well, somebody then misprinted your text. Your text has the term secularist critique.
So, okay.
And so does Arvind Rajgopal, who...
Yeah. Okay, I'll give you Arvind. But for myself, what I mean, and there is a distinction between what Arvind and I are doing, because my question was not, you know, my question was, why is it that people are caught having to defend secularism? And the answer is because they're secular subjects. They're caught in their own secularity, right? Their secularism is not thin like an ID card, as Gayatri would have it, but it's thick as an identity. Right. And that is what traps them in this need to critique secularism. And that's what I see. I mean, with respect, I came in halfway, as you know, dramatically in the elevator, but I didn't hear the beginning. But that's, I think, the crucial move post-47, is the creation of this kind of secular self.
Right. So if you don't think of it as a secularist critique, and the word secular is, of course, just ambiguous between secularism and secularization, so you have to first disambiguate it and then decide which it is. And I think, you know, when you stress the everyday and so on as an essential part of it, that's what I mean by the unself-conscious pluralism. And so really, that's the side on which it falls.
Actually, this emphasis that you placed on, or which Nehru and Gandhi both spoke of historically as an unself-conscious pluralism, which was ingrained in Indian society, is interestingly being positioned historically from a very self-conscious pluralist position, isn't it? Like, if you think of the moment in which they begin to think about this unself-conscious pluralism of a lived history of pluralism, in a way something that Ashish Nandy keeps referring to, saying that secularism then becomes this enforced, this self-conscious imposition of something that people were ingrained to do naturally. But I'm thinking that that itself then becomes a positioning of kind, to say we do not need the European form of secular, because we have a different history of unself-conscious pluralism. But I'm saying that, do we take that positioning, that it's a value they're placing, but they're doing it from a position which is very much about a different form of pluralism, which needs secularism to defend it, right? So I'm therefore wondering that, and that will then also raise the question that they're believing in a nationalism which was not going to be majoritarian, right? That was an understanding that unself-conscious history of pluralism could produce a nation state and a nationalism which would not need the defense or which would not need the ideology of secularism to protect that pluralism, right? But that is precisely at that moment that it needs it, right? At the time when they're talking about the unself-conscious history. So I wanted the reflection on that.
So my view is that Ashish Nandi's reading of Gandhi ought really to be a reading of Nehru as well. Because Nehru also was committed to a centralized state, because he was committed to central planning, a centralized state, and so on, all other aspects of modernity, I think Nandi just sees secularism as part of that. But I think we should keep, not all bad things are the same bad thing either, right? So my reading is Gandhi and Nehru are not very different, and Nehru is quite explicit about this in Discovery of India, which is why somebody like Irfan Habib hates the book Discovery of India, because it doesn't have all the standard scientific temper and all that that all the some aspects of Marxism have made central to these things. So Tapati, my view is, of course, to some extent, it's a very self-conscious move, but the self-consciousness comes because they're trying to articulate a different way of building the nation through anti-imperialism. So that's the self-conscious part of it, and they're tapping an unself-conscious pluralism to do it. So I would say such self-consciousness as there is in the deployment of something, and the self-consciousness is really to produce an alternative form of nationalism or nation building. And I don't think it inflects, it's an interesting question, to what extent it inflects the unself-consciousness of the pluralism with self-consciousness. I don't know. I mean, it's bound to be self-conscious to some extent, because it's now, as I see it, being part of a self-conscious mobilization of Muslims in things like the Khilafat, in things like the Muslim Mass Contact Program. But that's where the self-consciousness is. I think we should be allowed to say that a self-conscious alternative nationalism being formulated is exploiting an unself-conscious past. We should be allowed to say that without being made anxious about the pluralism becoming self-conscious.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions. Here and then Vazira.
Hi, Akeel. Thank you. I confess I didn't get some parts of the argument, but I think I have a comment and a question. The comment is, I wonder why you have let the colonial state off the hook. I mean, the colonial state and its policies and laws and technologies of governance sets the stage, I would argue, for producing, possibly, the Gandhian, Nehruvian counterposition, right? And I did not get a sense from you at all. You were not taking the colonial project seriously at all. And I'm concerned about that, so I wanted your reaction to that, unless I'm misreading. But the question is, I think, especially after this, your response to Tapati, I'm now confused about what pluralism is. How is it different from multiplicity, a term that Gandhi uses a lot, or diversity, which Nehru uses a lot, right? So analytically, for your argument, how would you distinguish between pluralism, multiplicity, and diversity? I think it's mindful as data.
Sure. It's true. The colonial state and the effects it had on the matter of religion and politics is not something that I focused on at all. But I'm not sure why I let them off any hook. I mean, I just didn't, it wasn't.
Both Nehru and Gandhi have to take the positions they do as nationalists,
Yeah.
because they have to counter, right, the way the colonial state is positioned as subjects, right?
Well, the anti-imperialism was countering the imperial state. Sure. Yeah, that's why they were replaying the. See, nationalism was being defined as a pluralist mass mobilization involving religious minorities in a national cause, right? That's the sense in which, in a national cause understood as anti-imperialism, not nationalism in the European sense. So that's the sense in which the colonial state is the target of all this. And I just took that for granted. I didn't, it would have been to change the subject of the paper to make it the explicit focus of my paper.
Okay, so I'll just ask the last question, which actually follows on Sumati's, in that I'm actually compelled by your history pre-1947 that you're giving for a kind of pluralism, unself-conscious pluralism at work in Gandhi and Nehru's work. Yet, I wonder the distinction you make between antecedents and roots is one that holds up to the historical account, particularly given that if you see from the late 19th century onwards, you have a number of different kinds of configurations of writing history. And that's something Tapati and I have been talking a lot about, reading, particularly in the domain of culture and the making of antiquity, as a very critical, essential soul of the nation, the spirit of the nation. And one in which that ancient past is secured in ways and on the spiritual register, on the cultural register, which ends up, one could say, I don't know where the word alienation would come in here, to an experience in which then the Khilafat and the mass contact movement become really important. And then to what extent then 47 as a conceding to a kind of nationalism, if whatever the project of Pakistan, however you might, the concession to that fact, in what way does that in fact alter the relationship of pluralism to...
So quickly, two things. The first is that maybe I've done this too cleanly, and this may be a space to muddy the things, but my instinct is to say that what you and you say, Tapati, also are trying to explore is really on the side of secularization. It's not got to do with secularism. And on the matter of antecedents versus roots, this is something that everybody is going to be very vexed by. People are very keen to say that Narendra Modi and the BJP can be traced back to the 1920s. I had this excruciating conversation with, what's his name? Javed Akhtar, who tried to tell me all of Muslim communism started with Khilafat. I mean, just if somebody doesn't read the effects of the Khilafat movement on how tremendously progressive. Just take Bengal, read Bloomfield's book, read Rajat Rai's book. I mean, these are books that the tremendous impact of these things. To say, Shahabuddin, it goes back to Khilafat. I mean, I find this is no way to do history. If people can invoke antecedents, of course they will invoke antecedents. They will repeatedly invoke it. But it is completely different. A root means there's a causal, organic pathway from the former to the latter. Who has established that? If you want to look at real causes, look at the fact that the Jan Sangh became the BJP only because, I mean, the kind of thing it became was to combat all sorts of interventions in the 80s having to do with the Mandal Commission, the perception of Hinduism as divided, the need to unify Hinduism against this perception. These are the things which took root in creating a kind of Hindutva politics. Of course, it invoked Savarkar, but this is when it started to take roots in the actual politics of the country. right? You can invoke antecedents, but roots happen when there were very specific things that made it the kind of mass element in politics, in electoral politics. So I'm going to run with this until somebody shows me what the root causal root and pathway is.